Good morning, everyone. Welcome to, I think it's the fourth day of this wonderful festival. It's a huge thrill to be on the stage here with Richard. I was thinking, in his book, there's a great passage which references festivals and literary events like this, and he compares it to church going in his youth. These are our kind of sort of contemporary churches, really, and it's where we come to affirm our faith in liberal values and so on. And he imagines himself sitting somewhere near the back of this audience, a sort of incorrigible heretic, and sort of making the odd wry comment and joke about what's going on stage, and not quite believing all the bullshit that's there. So in that spirit, with that in mind, we will be talking for about half an hour. Richard's going to read a little bit from his wonderful book, Question 7, and then we'll invite some questions from the audience. And so if you make a little note of things as you're going along, that would be great. We should sort of kick off. I mean, this book it goes in lots of directions, but it's partly a book about origins, it's partly a book about beginnings and working out where to begin, almost, in writing a memoir. What was the impetus for writing it in the first place?
Well, when the book came out, I wasn't entirely honest about its origins, as writers rarely are. But what had happened was I'd had a diagnosis of early onset dementia, which was troubling as it was about the only functioning organ I thought I had left. And I was given 12 months to settle my affairs, after which, things were going to get bad very quickly. And this was deeply shocking, obviously, to me. But in that time, I wanted to write a book which was really about what it is to live and why, what it is to live, what it is to love. They were the things I was concerned with. And so I spent these 11 months, when I was meant to be getting my affairs in order, writing this book. And I had to write it very quickly because there were many things I wished to say. And I particularly wanted to write about kindness and gratitude and love. And I finished the book and I sent it off to my publisher of 30 years, Nikki Christa, and I waited with some trepidation a reply, because I had no idea if it really wasn't just the confusions of this increasingly addled mind. And after about a day, she rang. And my very first question, which I stammered out, was, "Does this show signs of cognitive collapse?" And she just started to laugh and laugh. And I felt a weight beginning to leave me. And then a couple of weeks later, I saw the neurologist again. And in fact, there'd been a mistake in the radiologist's original readings of the MRIs. And there was no early onset dementia, and
we were saying that it's almost the gift to a writer to have that kind of urgent. I mean, it's obviously a horrible thing to hear, but a gift to have that kind of urgency about having to do something and having to make this kind of statement of account, almost.
Well, yeah, I mean, writers are dreadful procrastinators. I could have spent that year sharpening pencils, and it did concentrate the mind. We were talking about this just before we came on stage, and I was talking about how Anthony Burgess was given a terminal cancer diagnosis in 1964, and in the year he wrote 3 books, 2 of which are lost to anyone's memory, but one of which is that great book, Clockwork Orange. And of course he then didn't die and kept on. It was famously Dostoevsky, was taken to the scaffold, but then was given the pardon by the Tsar. it does concentrate the mind and make you think differently.
And it's very much a book about memory, kind of intimate family memory, but also wider ideas of memory. And were you, as you were writing it in that sense, testing your memory almost, you sort of, I feel you as, when you're writing it, you're almost matching up what you can remember, what you think you can remember almost. It's like a testing of what you know.
Well, I think memory, we have this idea, it's certainly in the West, since World War II, that memory is an act of testimony. And testimony is certainly enormously important. But memory is also an act of creation. And it's very odd as a novelist to revisit these events which you believe are foundational to you. And the more you ponder them, you realise that perhaps many things never happened at all, that you've just invented certain ideas about yourself and you've lived in those stories. So the book is in part about that, but there is one memory in it which wasn't invented at all and which I'd largely locked away, and it is this memory of an incident where I nearly drowned. And that was a very strange memory because I had to excavate it, and each day I would descend into this dark place in my consciousness, and it would be utterly alive, and I would be standing outside it as if it was still happening. And I wrote this part of the book simply as a reporter. And in all this, I came to think about time a lot and the way we conceive of time and novelistic and European ideas of time. And none of these had ever felt very satisfactory to me because I grew up in a culture where time was circular and people told stories that never really began and never really ended but digressed endlessly, and that was the beauty and the charm and the wonder of them. And I'd spent some time with the Yolngu people, an Indigenous tribe in far northeast Australia, northeast Arnhem Land, a remarkable people with an extraordinary culture. And they, in their language, they actually have 4 tenses. So in English, I don't know how tenses work in Indian languages, but in English we obviously have the 3 tenses of past, present and future. The Yolngu have a 4th tense in which past, present and future exist simultaneously. And so the example that was used with me when they were trying to explain it was that we were down making fish traps on the beach out of stones. People were we were simultaneously making these fish traps with people 1,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, and people 1,000 years into the future and 10,000 years into the future. And the song lines connect you both to these people in the past and in the future and to the land itself. And this idea struck me as both extraordinarily remarkable and utterly familiar, and because things that matter to us never leave us, they never pass, they're present and they're constantly shaping us. And so the book is written in a way where the past is always alive now and remains alive going into the future. So the book is about memory and about time, and it was also an attempt to explain myself to my readers around the world, because people assume, coming from what's seen to be a Western country, that the book's written out of a European tradition, but my books aren't. They come out of a particular experience, the Tasmanian experience, and I wanted to explain that. And the European novel, for all its brilliance, posits ideas that make no sense to me. The idea of individuals being alone. Kafka's K dies like a dog. Rilke sees the purpose of marriage solely in that each partner guards the other's solitude. I was brought up in a world where you were connected to all these other people. I mean, I grew up in a family. I was one of 6. I got 50 first cousins, as they say, the most confusing day in Tasmania's Father's Day, and it just goes on and on. And so there was that aspect of solitude, and there was also the idea of the natural world being a force of liberation and transcendence, which is both an Indigenous idea but comes out of our colonial history, where we were a totalitarian society that was a slave society, a convict society. We also saw the most complete attempt at a genocide of the Tasmanian Indigenous people. And in all that, the cities were oppression, and the land, the forests, the rivers, the seas, they were freedom. And I wanted to try and explain this utterly different context out of which my books came.
I mean, within that sort of framework, within that sort of continuous present almost, or the sort of abiding figure at the centre of it probably is your father in this. I mean, I do a lot of these kind of interviews, and talking to writers and artists, particularly male writers and artists, it's always the useful question is, what kind of man was your dad? What kind of man was your old man? And part of this meditation on mortality, which obviously was brought about by your diagnosis, is also a meditation on your parents' mortality and losing them. Could you just talk a bit about what kind of a guy was your dad, and how did you kind of explain him to yourself?
Oh, well, they were my mother and father, and I think to the extent the book deals with my father, it deals with my mother and father, and it deals with their love. And what occurred to me, because I live in this remote island, it has this remarkable natural world where there are birds and animals and plants and fish that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And I had the great joy of growing up in the wonder of this extraordinary natural world. But in the last decade, it's just started to vanish, species after species, for various reasons vanishing. There's a parrot, the swift parrot, that lives in the bushland next to my home, and there's less than 400 of them left. They'll be gone in 10 years. A few bays around from my home, there's a fish that walks on its front fins, the red handfish. There's about 80 of them left. Most likely they'll be gone in a decade. And I started thinking how a world I took for granted, this natural world, has been destroyed in the last quarter century. And with it, values of love and kindness, compassion. And I'm talking to you on the day that I just read this morning that Donald Trump is now fast-tracking his Anschluss of Greenland with his tariffs on Europe. And we live in a world that's been decimated by a revolution that proposes completely different values. And we haven't just lost this extraordinary natural world, we've lost certain values along with it. And I just kept on thinking of my mother and father and all this. There's a passage in the book. Could I read that?
Do you want to read?
Thank you. And this sort of explains something of what I was trying to say. I won't read for long. I was brought up in the church, so I've got a very low tolerance for boredom, and I would hate to bore any of you. I'll stand up to do this. I always feel it's strange to sit reading. My mother and my father, different as they were, he with his reserve, she with a passion, he with his distance, she with her engagement. My mother and father, born to poverty and grateful to the point of astonishment that their children had all lived, that they did not want for food and knew pain only rarely, fully accepted the unequal terms on which the world had come to them, for they were alive and lived. On only one matter would they not budge: the inviolability of their souls that they somehow kept beyond corruption. My illiterate grandfather understood something fundamental. If you don't have principles, he once told my father, you may as well jump off the end of the jetty. Inscribe that above every parliament and boardroom entrance. Crayfish to no man, Tom, my father's brother and a labourer all his life, once said. Tattoo that on every politician and journalist's forehead. Tom died playing darts in the St Leonard's Hotel. Great Uncle Babes used to play piano at the St Leonard's Hotel as well as at Mardoir's brothel. One night there was a brawl in the brothel and his songbook was torn in the melee and scattered all over the floor. Babes because he was the 13th of 13 children, well primed himself, grabbed random pages off the floor and continued playing seamlessly, passing from Home on the Range on the ripped left-hand page to Beautiful Dreamer on the right without missing a note. My mother and father had a similar gift of stitching together torn fragments into some harmony amidst the melee of daily life. My mother and my father, in their stories and jokes, in their generosity and kindness to others, asserted the necessary illusion their lives might mean something in the endless tumult of a meaningless universe. For them to live, love had to exist, the love they valued above all things. They lived that love and they fought for that love and they defended that love. With the passing of time, this illusion became their hard-won truth. It was a form of magic, and they the magicians. In my vanity, I'd always thought of them as naive. Only now, writing these words, do I finally see that the naivety was mine alone. Thank you.
That passage, and there's a lot of those kind of extraordinary, kind of moving and intimate sort of passages in the book, but they're set against this kind of wider sweep of kind of seemingly chaotic history from which you're, suggesting that there's no pattern, but also building a pattern, really. And you are, the driving. So the book begins with you going back to the place where your father was had been a prisoner of war, and meeting the guards that had brutalized him, and setting this against the fact of Hiroshima and the fall of the atom bomb, which essentially saved his life by liberating him from the camps, without which obviously you wouldn't have born, this book wouldn't have existed. And then you go back, really looking at a sort of chain reaction to another a formative event, which was the first time human beings imagined atomic energy or the atomic bomb. And you wonderfully isolate this moment at a moment where H.G. Wells, the Edwardian prophet and novelist, had an amorous encounter with Rebecca West, the sort of free-spirited journalist who was only 19. He was mid-40s, and it was hard to imagine him not in a tweed suit, really. And you pinpoint this moment as the first, essentially the beginning of the atomic age, the atomic century. Can you just talk a little bit about how that sort of chain of thinking came into being, really?
Well, I've always been aware that I only exist because of this terrible crime against humanity that was the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this has been a strange irony to live with. And so I've thought a lot about the bomb and read a lot. And we live in an age where we're told numbers divine everything about us. We live in an age of so-called metrics. We're told that everything is replaceable by binary code. We allow ourselves to be enslaved by an algorithm, a system of numbers, in the service of creating more numbers in the absurd and obscene profits for a handful of corporations. But numbers don't ultimately shape us. Stories do. And the story of the bomb is conventionally presented as a series of scientific discoveries building on each other that inevitably lead to Hiroshima. But when you examine the history deeply, it doesn't begin with numbers and formulas. It begins with a kiss in an Edwardian library in 1911 between, as Tim has said, H.G. Wells and a young Rebecca West. And Rebecca West offered up this absolute and complete love to Wells, who, although being a proponent of free love, was terrified by it. And he was so frightened by what the intensity of emotion that she offered that he fled to Switzerland to his mistress's chalet. He had a complex love life. And there he wrote a book in which, based on the latest scientific researches, because Wells was actually, had studied science and was well versed in it, and he was up with the latest discoveries about what was then called radium studies and early physics. And he extrapolated from that this idea of a weapon of mass destruction so awful that something the size of a pineapple could blow up and kill everyone in a large city. And he called this weapon, based on that latest research, the atomic bomb. And the book was called The World Set Free. And Wells went so much further than the scientists of the day, who dismissed this idea as outrageous, people like Rutherford, and who kept dismissing it up until the late 30s. But Wells's book came to inspire a young Jewish refugee to London in 1933, a refugee from Hitler's Germany called Leo Szilard, who was a brilliant young physicist who'd trained under Albert Einstein. It inspired him to come up with the idea of the nuclear chain reaction. And after that, the bomb becomes inevitable. And Szilard recognises that with this idea of the nuclear chain reaction, that not just is a bomb possible, but the enslavement of the world to the people who have the bomb. So he understands both the scientific inevitability of it and also the profound political and moral consequences of it. Szilard ends up terrified Hitler will get the bomb, and he persuades Einstein to petition Roosevelt to begin what becomes the Manhattan Project and ultimately leads to the bomb. And by 1945, Szilard was terrified that the bomb, which was to stop Hitler, would now be dropped on Japan where it wasn't needed, and tried to persuade the scientists to rally and persuade the government not to go ahead, and he failed in that. But that is why the bomb was dropped. And that is why I'm here speaking to you today, because a century ago, a man wrote a novel and we all became imprisoned in that story, and we're still living it today. We wouldn't have Gaza without the fact of Israel having the bomb. We wouldn't have Ukraine without Russia possessing the bomb. We still live under the shadow of the bomb. The terror of Trump's Greenland Anschluss is that he might withdraw the nuclear umbrella to Europe, facing up against the large nuclear arsenal of Russia. So we are still living the consequences of that kiss globally today.
And, I mean, there's a lovely irony, or horrible in some ways irony of that Big Bang moment being a kiss, being a sort of a moment of ardent kind of passion and so on, and all of this horror and unfolds out of that. Do you, when you, I mean, we should probably talk about what question 7 is, I guess, which is kind of somewhere. There's a lot of questions asked in the book. One of the book gets its title from this question, which was posed by Czechov, which it might just worth mentioning what the question is, because.
Yeah, of course. The question. Czechov, of course, famously said of Anna Karenina when he was asked about it, is it a good book? And he said, it frames the questions correctly. And amongst Chekhov's earliest writings, when he was an impoverished student trying to support his family and his medical studies, he used to write these comic sketches for newspapers to try and supplement his income. And one of these very early stories is a series of absurdist jokes, and it's presented in the form of those mental arithmetic problems you're given in school. And question 7 of the 12 questions asked by this mathematician goes something like this. 17th of April, a train leaves station A at 3 a.m. and arrives at station B at 11 p.m. Just as the train is about to depart, an order comes that it must arrive at station B at 7 p.m. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? That's question 7. And I think in that you have the genius of Czechov, and you have really the template for every great story he wrote thereafter, because his stories always begin in a seemingly real world, a dinner party, some work situation, and it's a recognisable world of timetables and social manners and so on. And then he goes to a conscious world where people are thinking certain things, which we're also familiar with. But then he goes to this next place, this subterranean place, where great books go. And that's where the real world is, the world of these questions that actually haunt us in the middle of the night, which are the things that define us. Why love? Who do we love? How to live? And these are the great questions that make Chekhov's stories so remarkable. And Czechov never proposes answers to these questions. And I think if you're writing journalism or history, your role is to progress outwards, and you see and touch and hear certain things, and you report back on them as best and as accurately as you can. But if you're writing novels, you seek to apprehend and divine the truth a different way. You seek to travel inwards into your own soul and discover things there. And the way you interrogate your soul is by asking questions of it, but never thinking that you have the answer. And so this book, which masquerades as a memoir, was written out of the novelistic part of me. I do write journalism sometimes, but I approach it in a different manner, and non-fiction. But this came out of the novelist side of me, the part of me that sees writing as simply about asking questions and trying, as Czechov said, to frame the questions in the correct manner.
And those questions, you know, are sometimes rational, but more often kind of irrational when judged on the surface of life. Really, you're trying to get below that surface. I mean, there's
Well, there's that great line of Dostoevsky's where he says in Notes from Underground, reason is a very fine thing, but the rivers run with blood, and wanting is the sum of all human life. I think that's true. Like, in part, question 7 deals with these ideas of reason and rationality, and how inadequate they are when they're set against the strange wantings and irrationality of us as human beings.
Do you, the book, I mean, the other kind of origin story in the book is a little bit of a sort of an interrogation of how you became a writer. You have wonderful passages about you as a child. Your mother was a great reader, and she used to read The Wind in the Willows, amongst other books to you. But you also had a problem as a child. You had a hearing problem, which meant that you found it hard to form words. And there's a sense of that becoming, the writer was created in that moment almost, that you couldn't quite communicate, but you were desperate to communicate. Is that how you look back on it?
I'm not really much interested in myself. So even with this book, which pretends to be about me, it's about other people. But I guess what I did learn from this period of deafness is that once you have these disabilities, you become written upon. You become the subject. You're told what you are, who you are. You're defined. Definitions belong to the definer, not the defined. And I think books did seem a way out of that, or words, the written word did, because I didn't have the spoken word. But beyond that, my grandparents, as I mentioned earlier, were illiterate, and the only difference between me and them is 2 generations of Free State education. And my father, who was the only one of his family to get something beyond a 2 or 3 year education, he had this profound sense of the magical power of the written word, which I think is lost in families and societies that have had mass literacy for generations. And he understood that in English, the 26 abstract symbols of our script are magical in their power to conjure up worlds, to divine the world, and that they are ultimately liberating and transcendent. And the corollary of that was the prison of poverty that he saw his mother and father live in. And he said to me, words were, the written word, as he grew up in terrible poverty, he said, the written word was the first beautiful thing I ever saw. And he could recite long passages of poetry. And so he was sort of, he was both of the written word, but also of an older oral idea of what the written word or what literature is, that it's also a song and an incantation. And I think all those things were very powerful in shaping me. And also books, but books had this, we had very few, but they were seen to be, my parents didn't really respect material things. They didn't respect success much or money, but they did think that someone who could write, that was a sacred thing.
They must have been thrilled that you became a writer in that sense.
They were terrified at the beginning because it wasn't clear how you'd make money. I had a family very young, and after I wrote my first novel, my mother said to me, "Well, you've done that. Now you should find a real job." So I remember a TV crew came to make a documentary on me, and my father said, it was a well-known show. He said, "Why are they doing that? They only do famous people." It was.
There's a great moment in the book where Richard goes to tell his father that he's won a scholarship to Oxford, and your father was out in the garden.
Oh yeah, that was great. So he, it's this very prestigious scholarship, but they were so hugely uninterested and unimpressed by these things, and so I'd got this ticket out from this remote island. I went to see them. My mother's in the kitchen, and I tell her, and she's making bread, and she sort of looks up and she says, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell your father, he might be interested." And went back to the bread. So, and he was down in the backyard forking compost, which is what he spent much of his later life doing. He just forked compost. He made a lot of compost and never used it. He just like looking into this sort of strange transformation of life. So he's there forking the compost, and so I go and go up to him, and I go, "Dad," and he doesn't turn round. He just keeps forking through the peat and the worms. I said, "I've won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford." And he doesn't turn around. And then he says, "If you should meet with triumph or disaster, treat these two imposters just the same." That was the end of the audience. I just laughed, you know, because it was absolutely true. I mean, these things are just strange phantasmagoria, you know, that they're utterly meaningless. And love and kindness and goodness, they're what endure and what allow us to live and give meaning to us. And that's all there is.
That seems a good moment for us to end here, but we can, if there are questions from the audience, please put your hands up, and I keep them quite brief because somebody will come around with a mic. If this chap here on the front with a yellow shirt.
Good morning, Richard sir. Your book, question 7, describe your journey Australia to Oxford. I want your opinion how to make word more inclusive as your opinion in terms of peace, wellness, and good order.
I think you're saying, how do we make the world a better place? Really, that's really the gist of it? I mean,
I want to know your opinion how to make word inclusive.
You know, these are questions above my pay grade, as they say. I just think it matters to be kind and honour kindness. I think perhaps the problem of our age are not the awful things happening around us. It is that we too easily take our compass from power. And if we look only to power, and if you look at your phones and your screens all the time, really all you see there is power's propaganda. And if you take your compass from that, there is only despair. But that's not the real world. The real world is the people around you, your family, your friends. And if you look to them, you see flawed people like yourself, but you see kindness and goodness every day. And if you start thinking and honouring that, then that is a source of enormous hope. So I have no answer for your important question. But I do think if we look to ourselves, there is enormous hope. But if we allow ourselves to be seduced by the protestations of power, we'll live only in despair and then they've won.
Another question. Again, down here at the front, there's...
Good morning, Richard sir. My name is Surendra Sharma. By profession, I'm a teacher. What would you give your advice like to young readers and writers, those who are trying to understand a rapidly changing world nowadays? As you have discussed a lot about the mass of weapon destruction and everything. So my question is, what would you like to give your suggestions related to those who wanted to understand this world, this rapid changing world? All right? Thank you.
Well, I would say read books, read poetry, and don't believe the lie that technology is inevitable. Don't believe the lie that something like AI is going to replace human function. You know, AI is founded on a fundamental mistake, which is that language is about finding the next word. Flaubert famously thought if you searched hard enough and worked hard enough, you could find the perfect phrase. But in the middle of Madame Bovary, he suddenly steps out of his novelistic voice, and there's this strange cry of despair. And he says, why is it none of us can ever express the exact measure of all our thoughts and sorrows and needs and love? And all human speech is like a cracked kettle upon which we tap crude rhythms for bears to dance to, when all the time we long to move stars to pity. And what you learn as a writer is that you long to move the stars to pity, but you only ever tap crude rhythms. But somewhere in that abyss between that aspiration and your failure is meaning for other people. And it is there, in that abyss, in books, in art, that we can find the fundamental truths to help us live. So I would say to your students, go there and know, you, above all, you're not alone. If art only has that defence, it is infinitely justifiable.
There's a woman just halfway along the row there.
Hi, good morning. So unfortunately, I haven't read any of your books, yeah, but I intend to. So which is that one book you would recommend for me to start with, ideally non-fiction?
I don't know. I just hope if you read them, you like them and you get to finish them, you know. I sort of, I mean, I think, you know, as Keith Richards said of the Rolling Stones, he'd seen a lot better bands, you know. Like, there's a lot of good books out there. But look, maybe start with question 7, because that will give you an idea of why I wrote the other books. It would be a key to the door of the others. And if you don't like that, well then you don't have to bother with the rest. And
Any more questions? Yep, chap right in the far back corner there.
It may be not related, but I did not understand ever the Hiroshima, but I have a very impossible time understanding Nagasaki. The first bomb you can debate, but the second bomb is impossible to debate and understand.
there's an endless historical debate that has never ended and will never end as to whether the first bomb should have been dropped or whether the second bomb was justified. And I think what both these things miss is the utter evil of war, of which the bomb was just an expression. War is the greatest obscenity, and to live in a time when some of our greatest leaders are seeking to rush into it is sad and terrible beyond compare, and everyone who does what they can to avoid war is to be applauded.
We've got time for one last question. So, on the far side over there, right over there. Sorry, halfway back, there's a lady with both her arms in the air. She's very keen.
Thank you, and we're really happy you don't have cognitive decline. There was a talk on art under siege, and it seems you were under siege and H.G. Wells was under siege. Do you think that the threat of illness was a creative inspiration for you?
The threat of death certainly was, yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, and it even informed the shape of the book. So it had to be a short book, and so I constructed it like a Jenga pile. I kept pulling things out and seeing what was the bare minimum to sustain each story. And in all that, the one thing I've learnt as a writer is to trust the reader. And the less you tell the reader to think, the more the reader will discover in your book. And so I always believe reading is a more intelligent and creative act than writing, and it was in that spirit that I wrote this book. And that was informed by the fact I thought I might not be here to see it come out.
I mean, you were saying at the time it would be your last book, but obviously it's great to hear. We were talking backstage that you're writing other books, and it's not your last word, obviously.
No, I after it came out, and I was relieved to have intimations of continuing life. I rather enjoyed myself with friends and family, and I found that I didn't care if I wrote or not for a long time. But I've found myself back at the table more recently, and I have 2 books now, slowly forming into shape, and I find it a great joy to be there once more.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a great pleasure and joy to sit here with you and listen to you. Richard's books are on sale all over the place. I urge you to read not only this book, but all of the books. I think he's going to be signing some of them after this.